the original question was basically how do you handle logging in Unity? And so we'll just do a really quick example, and I will set up a quick script. And I'll just throw together something like, I don't know, item spawner. It's about as classic a Unity thing as you can get. And the question becomes, how do I intend to log that it's spawning and when it should spawn and so on? So first thing I like to do is, well, not spawn. We'll just start with the very basics of make it do whatever the actual script is supposed to do. So spawner should spawn, and quick and dirty solution is, I guess, item equals, and I'll wait for writer to catch up. Thank you. And we'll go with a sphere. There's a spawner. We will add a component of rigid body so it actually does something, and job done. Right. And then we will add a context menu so that we can call it in the editor, because we don't really need to have anything else just yet. Still processing. Ah, good. You finally caught up. Okay, now, here's where we get to the question of why. So if I have my item spawner, I drop my script on it, and I press play. I don't think you even have a camera at the moment, so it's not going to draw here, but it doesn't matter. Look at the scene view. And spawn object, and there you go. It's spawning our spheres perfectly. Now, here's where we get the logging. So the default logging solution is, of course, just to do a debug.log and spawning. Now, that'll work perfectly fine, and the Unity pros among you will know you don't even need to do this, because what you can do is you can just write print spawning. And that also works. And if we go down a level, print is literally just calling debug.log for you. It's just a static function built on mono behaviors. So literally exactly the same thing. Now, the first thing people want to do is they're like, well, I don't want to just use the Unity default logger. I want to do my own thing. And so perfectly reasonable expectations. And so people will go ahead and create their own logger. And I do this myself, and so I perfectly see the reason why. So if I say logger, and we'll do I'm going to call it cool logger. And this is sort of where we were in the demonstration on the conversation in chat. It's like we have a logger, we're using our own, and then this is perfectly fine, and we'll do some sort of log function. And we'll keep it nice and simple. String, message, and we'll just do a default log message to start. We can add more features later. So that's a logger, and then we might do is pass in our logger here and give it a serialized field, and rather than doing that, we will log our message using our logger. Now, basically the same thing, and I might even zoom in a bit just in case, and now we should have a field to populate our logger. So that's perfectly fine, and there are reasons why you do this. It does give us some benefits. But the first bits of advice I saw were people saying, well, why don't you just make it static? I mean, fine, we could make it static, and if we did, we would be replacing this line here with, instead of debug.log, with our coollogger.log. And in fact, let's just do that so we can, just for the sake of it. And if I was going to do it, I wouldn't even make it static. I would just do a static function on it. And then that static function would call, I'd probably even rename this to log message. I would then go for the classic instance singleton, and return the instance, and it always hates when I put it underneath. One can't find it, but I don't care. Oh, it can't. It's a mono behavior, or so I can't do it that way because of Unity. Ugh, I'm getting into my habits, so let's not do that. Let's do that instead. Get private set, and we'll just do the standard Unity mono behavior singleton, which I wouldn't do anyway, but that's a separate question. So that's a singleton, that's the instance, but I don't want to actually use logger.instance, that blah, it's kind of a waste. So I would actually call it in here, instance, and that should be static. instance.log message log. And what that does is it lets us do exactly the same thing, but we avoid the messy instancing thing. So coolLogger.log, that's the same as debug.log. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's better because what we can do with the coolLogger is we can add our own rules. We can do stuff like maybe we have a color for log color, and maybe we have some show logs or something, and then that might be our own version of should we even write them. And if that's the case, we go to our log messages, we if not show logs return, and then maybe for the log message we will do the classic like wrap it in a thing. So to write is equal to message if I want to probably put a flag to say should color logs, so color logs, and then if coloring the logs, then what we want to do is set that message to write equal to color tag of some color to our message to write, and then that color is going to be the color utility dot to HTML, whatever our log color is, and then we pop that in here. So there we go, we have a nice color logging thing, and that now supposedly justifies why we are using a custom logger, because now when we go to log our messages and we're using our magical custom logger, even if we don't use the instanced version, so if I get rid of him now because we're not actually using him, we're using the static version. This was the general advice I saw in chat, is you can now do fun stuff like this. So if I log a thing, oh, we're not showing a message, probably because our new flag is working as intended. So I now need to tweak that, add some color, and copy it because I forgot that we're in play mode. And item spawner, spawn, and we have our nice red spawning message. There we go. So that's supposedly a benefit we get from doing the logger. Here is where we get to my reasons I disagree that that's a good idea. Well, what have we really done? If we stick to this universe here, we have using Unity Engine as a static import. I just want to make sure everyone's still on board before I go too crazy down this rabbit hole. Yeah, no comments. Good. Right. So what have we done? Well, this used to be just debug.log. Now, what does debug.log really mean? If we have debug.log, what that really means is Unity Engine.debug.log. That's the implicit understanding that what we're actually doing is binding our application to Unity Engine. Now, that's normally a bad thing because it means if I was to give you this script and you move it to somewhere else, you are intrinsically tied to Unity Engine. But here's the thing. We are already doing that by the sheer nature that we're extending mono behavior. So abstracting out the debug is kind of pointless because it's already intrinsically part of another thing that we're already including in our application. So there isn't really a decoupling or benefit to moving this out because we're already doing it. Now, something I talked about in my video was this line is repeated in multiple, if you're using multiple places, like, you know, pre-spawning, post-spawning, you are calling it in multiple cases. So what you've got now is multiple scenarios that would have to change. So the amount of work to change this is increasing with every subsequent line. So one level of abstraction or decoupling or whatever you want to call it might be to make your own log message or method internally, which would use that. And that way, if you did want to later change what it's doing, you would have one place to do it, and suddenly the amount of code you have to change up here is very different. If we wanted to turn off all log messages or prefix all log messages with something, we could do it in one location rather than a million different methods. So there's benefit in doing this, but we're back to our original, why are we using debug.log or why not use our own version? Well, first and foremost, Unity, we're already in Unity, so we're going to get debug whether we want it or not. As long as it's mono behavior, you're getting the debug. So that's like, you're not losing anything or you're not gaining anything by trying to change to your own logger. But if you do change to your own logger, you can no longer distribute this file without also distributing your logger. So you're adding more complexity to your code by adding your own logger rather than debug for not really any benefit. We said, well, what about all the extra features we added? Isn't that a benefit? Well, no, because all those extra features you added, you don't actually need to include your logger to do it. So instead of using our debug fancy new logger, if we leave this as debug.log, what you can actually do is mark this as a log handler. And a log handler handles log messages. And so all we have to do is put our code, actually, you know what, I can even just call it here. I'm going to get lazy. Log message, we'll log whatever type of message it is, it doesn't matter. And we will just log the string.format of the format and the args. Now what's cool about this, and exception will do the same thing. I'm going to say log message. Obviously you'd want to handle these separately. I don't care right now. We're just going to keep it nice and simple. So this handles logs. What does that mean? Well, we can actually get rid of the singleton. We can get rid of this awake. We can get rid of this. And so we have our logger, but now all we have to do is one thing, which is in an awake function, we can say debug.unitylogger.loghandler, log handler, equals this. Now, all of our features are provided in debug.log because we are overriding what the log handler is doing. So all of those magical benefits we supposedly get from using our own static logger, we get without having to use our own static logger. If that's all you want to do, be able to do your own special kind of logging. Oh, doesn't like something we did Stack Overflow. Oh, I'm probably calling a cyclic. Oh yeah, because my logger is calling its logger. Yeah, you'd have to do your own thing. I'm not going to bother doing that right now. But either way, the point is, if you want to override how the logging is being handled, all you have to do is override the log handler. You don't need to go and write your own kind of custom logger just to do that. This is already like a way to do that. But I don't want to do that either. That's not the point of abstracting out a logger. When people abstract out a logger, they think it's to give themselves extra fun features, and change colors and have more control. It's not. It's the fact that when you log something, you may or may not want to do it later to different places or different kind of sources. So the other side of this that I saw was a question of, oh, well, if you use your own logger, you can do something like if unity editor. And that sounds like a good idea on the surface of it. But the problem with that is, well, if you're debugging and you want to see logs in a build, you now have intrinsically told Unity, literally at build time, to not ever allow you to log at an editor or when it's playing. So you have made a compile time decision to limit yourself to be unable to do a runtime decision, which is what logs would you actually like to log. So this is a bad idea to me because, like, you don't want to lock your own ability to be able to write logs when you want to see logs. So both of these to me are bad ideas. The short answer is the entire point of having custom logger is that per script or per system, you may want to do something different. You may want to log everything that has to do with the character to the screen, but you might want to log everything that's to do with the network traffic to a file and then obfuscate it with some ID codes so it doesn't show the real room IDs or something, and then save that file. So if a person was to save the file and send it to you as a client, you could have the information without them seeing it in the file. So there's a lot of things you might want to do that make logging unique that you'd like the freedom to do. And the downside to using debug.log is you don't have a way of doing that. Because yes, you can abstract and take over what the log is doing, but you don't have as much information about how you handle that. You do get some information, like we established here with the handler. You do get stuff like the log type, the origin, the source, and you can start to like divine if it came from this object and it did this and do this stuff. But now you're having to build a complicated logger that can know about every possible case it could be logging and handle each case, and now you're getting into case statement hell and we're back to more complexity. The much easier solution is to simply say, it's not my job as an item spawner to know about logging, and it's not my job as a logger to know about every possible system that ever might log. They are two unrelated systems. And so, let's make a item spawner that does, crazy as it sounds, item spawning. We make loggers that do logging, and then we choose a logger to give to an item spawner. And that way, the item spawner can use whatever logger it's currently using to log things, and then we can change our mind later as to how certain things handle. So I can create that logger again, and the beauty of this method, like I said, is even though there's multiple places, I can just down here change what logger we're using, and that's now log message. And now that we're not doing the other way, I'll actually revert that back because log is a better name, although never mind, it's fine. So there we go. That's back to that and back to that. So this is what I prefer, because the benefit of doing this is if I have a logger that's like a standard one, I can use that. But if I want to have a, you know, maybe I want to do a text file logger, and we're going to get rid of this log handler stuff because, like I said, I don't actually recommend doing it that way. It's just good to know that you can. So that's a logger, and then this is a different type of logger, so maybe I'll do a, I don't know, console logger. And that's also going to be a logger. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the cool logger as a base type. That way I can still use it in dragging and dropping in the inspector, but I don't want people to actually instantiate it. So do that, do that. The log color stuff and showing logs I'll keep. But what I might do is I might make it protected instead for simplicity. This is actually logging to console, so that's an implementation. So we'll take him. We'll make this abstract, and we'll make this abstract, and then we'll override it in our console logger to do the fancy color stuff, and then we'll do a second logger here, which hypothetically would say, I don't want to write a text to them right now. They're kind of a bit overkill. Yeah, I'll just pretend it's writing the text file. Otherwise, we have to start doing streams and stuff, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this. So the point is, we now have two different loggers that do different things, but they both implement cool logger, and that's log color. We make that protected as well. Now we can pop back over. And so we have different logging options, and we might make one for our console logs and one for our file logs. And that's going to be our console logger, and that's going to be our file logger. And then now we don't need that one anymore, and so we can swap out here which one we're going to use. Which I wouldn't even do either, because I'd probably be injecting this using some sort of root application. But that's irrelevant. The point is, I could now have a bunch of systems and I could hand them to different loggers. And I could have different loggers that go to different sources and do different things. So the point here is all of those questions about, oh, well, should you use a logger? Should it be your own class? Should you override the get function here of what you're calling it for? Should it be static? Should you use the if def thing for it? Preprocessor directive rather. All of those are not the point. None of those things are really doing anything new. They look like they're adding behavior or helping, but the fact of the matter is, if you're just trying to change the behavior of this existing logger, you can do all of that without binding this script to a whole new other system. If you're going to bind this script to a whole other system in the form of a custom logger, just replacing one static function call to another static function call gives you literally no benefits and all of the downsides. So if you are going to make your own logger, the only way to get value out of that is to use it in such a way where you are inverting that dependency, which means this logger is taking over the role, but not just where you're doing it, it's taking over the role in terms of choosing what that means. And if it's just another static function somewhere else, you still lose your ability to solve that problem on a per script basis. So there's no benefit. There's literally zero benefits to making your own logger class and just replacing the logger class for another logger class. The real benefit is doing something like this. Although, as I've said many times, even this isn't what I would do, because now you're hard-coded locked to your own cool logger thing here, and you've kind of tied yourself into what you're doing. What I would actually do, although this is way out of scope, I would ask myself if a spawner really cares too much about Unity stuff at all. And so, you know, maybe I would, how would I do this? I'd make my own logger interface. It would do some sort of logging. I would create something like a spawner. The spawner would take in a logger. This all is basically the same thing up to now. The only difference is that this script isn't a mono behavior. I'll do the spawner here. Although, again, I wouldn't actually be spawning here, and doing logging here. And now, by having this, I can replace this code here and get rid of this. I can do our spawn function. I can create the internal spawner, which means this has now become a humble object, which I'll explain why we did that in a second. So now this spawner requires some kind of logger. Now what you can do is we could just do our cool logger like we did before. And that one we can pass in here, which it won't like initially because that currently doesn't have that interface. So we'd go in here and give this logger. And so now we can use that in our logger as a injected dependency. Let's close a few of these for simplicity. So now we can do our spawner.spawn. That is one perfectly valid option. But the benefit of doing this now is we can start solving this in different ways that can sort of automate this process a little bit. So first things first, we're getting into like weeds here. The point of logging is usually to find out information, to solve problems. And realistically, if this function is called spawn, literally half the lines in the spawn function have nothing to do with spawning. They have to do with logging the information that is technically about spawning. So that's actually kind of irrelevant to what we're doing. In an ideal world, there'd be no spawn message, there'd be no logging messages here at all, because logging actually has nothing to do with spawning, really. So what I'd actually do here is, this is a spawner. I would create a logging spawner. And this will look like a spawner. And this is where we get into why interfaces are more important, because what you'd want to do is it generate? No, it's probably refactor. I always forget the order here. Refactor this, extract interface, iSpawner. Yeah, that's a spawner now. This also looks like a spawner. And then what you do is you take into your logging spawner some kind of logging solution and some kind of spawning solution. And that may seem like overkill, but why this is important should be apparent in a second. So now, our spawner, I don't think has our spawn function in it, so let's go ahead and add that. Now, again, this might look like a lot of code and I'm jumping around a lot, but that's because I'm trying to get to the answer. I don't do it this way. I do it incrementally, but we're kind of racing to the answer here. So by doing this, I can now copy these lines, put this here. I apparently called it logging this time because I'm a glutton for punishment. And I can do that. Spawner.spawn. So what I'm doing now is the actual spawner doesn't have anything to do with logging, because spawning and logging are not the same thing. Spawner now does spawning. Imagine that. This logging spawner takes in a spawner and the logging and then wraps spawning functions in logs if it so desires, but you doesn't have to. Now the benefit of doing this is that question of what if I wanted to do this at runtime, or what if I wanted to change things, we can go back to this guy here and we could say, okay, spawner equals new spawner. Cool, nothing crazy there. Then we have a logger, and then we could say do things like show logs. And if we do show logs, we can do simply if show logs spawner is a new logging spawner that uses that logger and that spawner. So what we can do, cannot instantiate type 2 spawner. Oh, that's because this is an iSpawner now. So what we can do now is, like, literally, if we want to debug spawning, we can just look at it. There's nothing in the way to read and understand about spawning. If we want to deal with logging, we can go to the logging. We're not messing with the concept of spawning. We're just dealing with the log messages. If I wanted to add localization, I could do it here. And I could localize my log messages, and it won't affect spawning and it won't affect logging because it's got nothing to do with that. It affects the intersection between logging and spawning. And the other benefit of this is to go back to that original idea of, oh, what if you wanted to do your if-def to control whether or not you're logging? Well, what if we don't do this? What if we literally instead just did if Unity editor, then wrap it in a logger? Now we get all the same benefits of being able to customize whether or not it's logging in certain contexts and do this, but we're not muddying up the code. We're able to completely change which spawner we're using. We can have different loggers, different spawners, and all of the code is clean and clear and explains what it's doing. That's probably what I'd do. But now we get into the mess of, yeah, but now you have to pass this in every time. What if we don't want to do that? What if at a very basic level, all we want to do is show standard Unity logs? Well, that's easy enough to do as well. So we have our concept of a logger. So let's go with a Unity standard Unity console logger. Let's go with that. Console logger. This is a logger which logs to, big surprise, Unity console. And so, debug log, message. This is a default implementation which logs to the Unity console. And in fact, this can be a singleton because there's something about this that has intrinsic state. So I can do an instance. I can do our Unity console logger, and this should really be an autocomplete, but I reinstalled Windows very recently, and so I don't have all of my IntelliSense set up the way I want to just yet. So we have to do it the long way. So there we go, instance, and now we have a default solution for logging. And I don't always like to have a default solution that's like a literal implementation. You also, if you're going to do default implementations, you want to do a no default implementation. So no logging, and that's if you don't want any logging at all. So no logging at all. Do that, and it just literally won't do anything. And very similar to that, we want this to be a singleton, and replace that. So now we've got multiple possible ways to log a thing. Logging it by not logging it by logging it to Unity, logging it by logging it to a cool logger, and all of those are different options. Now, if we wanted to simplify this class again, but to say, oh, this is all messy again, I don't want to do with that. Okay, let's not use the cool logger. Let's not deal with this. Let's simplify all of this, and all we have to do here is say, in this class, if I'm going to do a logging solution and I don't want to pick which one it is, I can just say, take in that one. But when it comes to the logger, we're just going to say this, use the Unity console logger. And that should be a static instance. I must have forgotten to make that static. And so, make static, and then he's going to complain because he should be static as well. And so, we now have a solution that doesn't even require a logger. So now we've got either use a spawner or wrap the spawner in a logger. And that's not that much difference in terms of code, but it gives us all the freedom. That will default to Unity logging, which we can override and change and whatever. But if we want to do other things to it, we can. So again, I can see how a lot of people would look at this and go, yeah, but it's a lot of messy boilerplate and you're doing extra code. Maybe at this stage it may seem like a lot of code, but I've now solved logging in perpetuity. I have a thing that does logging all of the time for all of my scripts whenever I need to, and if I ever need to change logging stuff, I do it here, and it's got nothing to do with the actual scripts I'm interfacing with. And that can be even simplified further. I can use like generics, I can do whatever I like, and I'm not going to muddy the actual code itself with seas of logs. I don't have to delete log messages if I change my code later, which, by the way, is one of the worst things you can do. If you have a script that's working and you're putting log messages in to check that it's working, you are literally rewriting an algorithm to check the algorithm's working. You don't think of it that way, but by adding code in to the thing that you're testing, you are saying, is this code working? Let me write code that changes the code I'm about to test to do something else before I test if it's doing the thing it's supposed to be doing. And then if you mess that up and you forget to delete a line, or you move a comma, or the act of you writing it causes something to take longer than it used to, there's a million ways that can break your code. So you shouldn't be testing that a code's working by changing what it's doing to test that it's working. That's insane. And so by separating out the thing that does the work from the thing that does the logging, they are two separate problems that you handle separately. So, that's a lot. That's the basics of why I don't like doing it that way. Like I said, to summarize, the short answer is, if all you're trying to do is change the behavior of the default logger, literally just look at the Unity default logger, and just to show you again, it uses internally, here, debug unity logger.log. What is unity logger? Unity logger is its own logging interface, which is this thing. So you can override that if you want to. If you don't want to override that and leave all the existing behavior, you can then go one step further and override the handler, where Unity will do all of the dispatching for you, and all you do is change what happens. And you could use this to just override two text files, or to change its colors, or to do whatever you want, and every single existing debug.log call throughout your application gets all the free magic features you asked for. That is the minimum option you can do if all you want to do is alter what it's already doing. You don't need to make your own logger just for that. If you are going to make your own logger, what is it adding for you? What benefit does it include? If you're going to do your own logger, it should be because you can now have multiple loggers. Why do you need multiple loggers? Well, that's only valuable if you've gotten to a point where your project is so big that logging everything at once is giving you a headache. It's hard to find anything because all the logs to do with the player are logging at the same time as the photon stuff, at the same time as the audio stuff, and it's driving you insane. You can't find what you're looking for, which is why most good assets like Master Audio or whatever will include their own logging toggle, because they know their stuff is noise when you don't care about it. So that is the point of having separate loggers, to be able to control on a per thing level what you're logging to. So if you're not doing that, then there's no point in having the logger. And if you are doing that, making a static logger that replaces the existing static logger, you can't do that. So all you're doing is locking yourself into the exact same problems you had before, only now you've added another dependency that has to go with you to every single project that you had before. So there we go. That was my summary on logging. Do I modify the logger myself? Not really. I don't find it that valuable. I think it's a cool thing to know you can do, and I only ever do it if I'm trying to filter logs. If I've been inherited a project and the asinine morons before me have written logs on every single bloody script in the project and it's firing 5,000 logs into the console and I'm like, I can't see what the hell is going on. If you override that log function, you can check the type of the object and do a little filter and just write, if object sender type equals player, show the log, otherwise hide all the other damn logs. Or if log error is of certain types, or if you want to add your own log levels. That's a really quick way to say, I just want to see the logs coming from this system. If they haven't given you a way to do that, I'll do a quick override, but I'll probably delete it afterwards. It's not an ongoing thing. Traditionally, I prefer to have the concept of logging in my code without an intrinsic specific implementation. So I'll do, like I said, I will make an iLogger of my own type. My iLogger will be included in all of my scripts, and everything I do will have a logging version to iLogger. And if I ever want to do logging, I can. If I don't have to. And if I want to tie it into the Unity system, I can just use my own version of an iLogger that ties to the Unity logger if and when I need to. How would I change settings if it's not a mono behavior? Well, the thing is, it literally doesn't matter, right? Like, I could do a static flags on an object. I could literally set them in the initialize on load property if I want to. Logging is a global property after all, so you're probably going to set it on application start. And people are like, oh, that's hacky. You don't want global static variables. Well, if you're setting it once in your application in a single script that's your logger that you can turn off, there's no cascading repercussions of that. The only reason globals are bad is because they're in 50 different classes and people are changing them, they're out of your control. Again, probably wouldn't do that, but that's an option. Another option, which is more likely, is I don't change the settings. What I actually do is I configure the settings in a application root, and I would use some kind of injection or factory that I would set it once, pass it into everything, and then everything gets that one, you know? Again, I don't use mono behaviors that much. I use mono behaviors for stuff that has to be mono behaviors, so I don't really do that. Be able to change it without compiling. Yeah, I mean, scriptable objects are fine. Honestly, like, if I literally need to change it at a case, so we're talking about the difference between compile time and runtime. If you need to change it at compile time, I don't mind changing it using a custom script or a custom scriptable object or something. I don't care. It doesn't matter which. They're all the same thing. They're all just something I write or type or click before I run it. And realistically, I don't think logging should be such a first class thing that you're tweaking it all the time. Logging should be an ability to inquire information later, and then, like, for example, I'll do a logging interface that will let me log things, and then I will make a custom logger that I might drop in as a prefab, press play with that logger in the scene, which will magically hook itself up and be used, and I'll just delete it before I do a compilation or something. So I can use it as information gathering, but I don't need it there all the time. So the idea of having logging as this settings thing that you configure all the time isn't really, I just don't see the point in that. Like, it shouldn't be a first-class citizen. It's a solution to a problem. So I just don't do that. But if I did want to, then I'd probably use something like a text file. Realistically, like, if you decided at runtime you want to control logging solutions, you probably want to control them at more than just the ability to do it at compile time in a checkbox, right? So if you're going to do that, then make the settings a struct or a class, have the settings have things like, you know, show, color, filter, whatever, and have a filter like a regex expression for what should show. And then have a text file, which is just the default settings for that's included on build of the project. Build a text file, drop the 3 settings into it, and then literally you can now tell somebody to open that file and change stuff if they wanted to tweak it themselves. That's if you're choosing to include logging in your build. Or you can have it some private code yourself that could change it. Or better yet, if you're building an application where you're trying to change it properly, you would then have your own console, have your own debug console that pops up, give yourself a console command that lets you say logging on off, right? So I think there's too much focus on like, oh, should I use scriptable object or a text file or no, the truth is make a thing that does the thing you need, make a way to change it, and then when you need to change it, find a solution that's easiest to do that. And the easiest solution for me to like change settings on a logger at runtime would be, wouldn't it be cool if I could pop up a little console, type stuff in and change it? Well, then I would do that because that's the thing I actually want to happen. Whether I do that via scriptable objects or via a text file is kind of irrelevant, right? Like we shouldn't be designing our code around like implementations. It should be, what do I want this to do? What do I have to do to make it do the thing I want it to do? So the short answer is I don't know the answer because I don't want to do that right now. And when I did, I would pick whatever comes to mind that would solve that problem to the best of its abilities. And if I needed some different behavior, I would do it a different way then, you know?